that when we talk about the pre-colonial, there is a lot of acrimony, a lot of debate, a lot of anger. There's obviously, we know about the Babri Masjid case, but much more broadly, there's a lot of claim that it's not that the colonials were the bad guys; it's the pre-colonial that was the bad guy, and colonial was a type of kind of arrival of liberalism and arrival of science and railways and all those kind of things. Basmati is the word basmati for rice is Indian and not Pakistani. In the Pakistani states, but it is in Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, bowls we see rice, and it's basmati there. And the Indian foreign minister is saying, no, it's a Sanskrit word. Well, I have news for the Indian foreign minister, because Sanskrit's main space was Peshawar and Taxila. So I don't know what to tell you, man.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Sri Manan Ahmed Asif. Welcome, Manan.
Welcome.
Did South Asia have a shared regional identity prior to arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century? This is a subject of heated debate in scholarly circles and contemporary political discourse. Manan Ahmed Asif argues that Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Republic of India share a common political ancestry. They are all part of a region whose people understand themselves as Hindustani. Asif described the idea of Hindustan as reflected in the work of native historians from roughly 1000 CE to 1900 CE, and how that idea went missing. Our guest Manan Ahmed Asif is an associate professor of history at Columbia University and author of A Book of Conquest. Today we'll discuss Asif's book, The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India. So, Manan, how did The Loss of Hindustan, The Invention of India, the book happen?
Thank you, Mithilesh, and thank you, Sunit, for inviting me, and thank you for giving me this space on Eastern Report to talk about my work. I'm very grateful. So this book is, in a way, this book started a long time ago when Shahid Amin, who teaches at Delhi University, historian Shahid Amin, modern South Asia historian, he was visiting University of Chicago, where I was starting my graduate training, and he taught a course in which we were looking at it was a graduate seminar on historiography. But what he did was that he basically focused on histories and historians who were from what I call Hindustan, and he said India, pre-colonial and colonial.
Yes.
And I think I kind of that seminar had a large impact on me. One of the things that stayed with me is that since 1947, in modern states of India and Pakistan, and later on Bangladesh, we think about these modern states from the perspective of the colonial rulers that for a very long time were part of our collective consciousness. And one of the things is that when we talk about the pre-colonial, there is a lot of acrimony, a lot of debate, a lot of anger. There's obviously, we know about the Babri Masjid case, but much more broadly, there's a lot of claim that it's not that the colonials were the bad guys; it's the pre-colonial that was the bad guy, and colonial was a type of kind of arrival of liberalism and arrival of science and railways and all those kind of things. And that's sort of for all nationalisms, that's a good story. It's a story that makes sense, right? It helps us figure out who's our friend and who's our enemy in our contemporary moment. But I think what happens as historians or as an intellectual historian, that you say, okay, all right, I mean, this is my present, this is your present, this is the world we live in right now. But it seems really weird to imagine that the world we live in right now has been unchanged for 700-800 years. That these types of stories are what constituted, the way people thought in the 13th century or the 14th century. And so that was really the kind of beginning of my, how do we get to this idea is that within the pre-colonial world, people and people here, it's very difficult to think about the period that I study, usually medieval period, and talk about people, because people's voices, even today with all our iPhones and snooping scandals, we can't get to the person in a real way, right? So to think about people in the medieval world is very difficult. So as an intellectual historian, one of the ways in which we can think about people is we can think about people who are writing history, among other genres, who are writing about the social or writing about the people. The approach I took, or the approach that this book is based on, is what we call the decolonial approach. It's trying to think outside of the colonial framework. And the idea that I'm trying to trace in this book is this idea of Hindustan. And what is this idea of Hindustan? What did it look like for people who were invested in it? People for whom it was a very important idea. Important in the sense that they wrote books about it, or they built monuments about it, or they commissioned music and plays about it, or they called themselves it. And then what happened such that it disappeared in a real sense. It disappeared, and when it was what was reborn, what gave birth to it afterward is what we now know as India, Pakistan. So that's really the decolonial way of kind of thinking about the medieval histories, where I started this book from.
Sure. Could you please explain the word Hindustan as you see it, as you have described in this book?
So there's two ways of thinking about words and origins. One is that we think about word from its grammar and its language base. Um, and the tricky part here is that theories of language and theories of grammar are also theories of colonialism. They emerge from the colonial effort to understand a type of linguistic hierarchy of the world. So one thing that the ways in which so William Jones, who was a very important figure in our history, in the sense that he's a colonial judge in Bengal and responsible for the Hindu code and other things. So for William Jones, the grammar of our subcontinent actually gave you ideas of the people of the subcontinent. And this is something that's very interesting, because William Jones himself, as a human being, as a person, was English and grew up doing Greek and Latin from his birth, basically, and then later German. So William Jones, the person, can do Greek but not be Greek, can do Latin but not be Roman, and can do German and not be German, and be English. But when William Jones comes to Calcutta, he says, well, if you are doing Hindustani, you're doing anything that's in the Devanagari script, you're Hindu. And if you're doing anything in the Persian script, or you're doing Persian or Arabic, then you're Muslim. Right? So this move, right, which doesn't exist for Greek or German or Latin, begins to become a part. So why do I say all this? Well, because when people say the word Hindustan, the first thing they say, well, it's not a word from the subcontinent. It's not a Sanskritic word. Yeah, it's not a Dravidian word, right? It's a Farsi, a Persian word, or old Pahlavi word. And the reason that's the first thing is because they're imagined that by etymology, what becomes clear from etymology is not any meaning of the word, but people. We get to know about people. So Hindustan, according to William Jones, then was a name that was derived from Sanskrit, Sindhu, that connoted a region, most likely around Indus Valley, somewhere around that. And that becomes picked up. This name gets picked up by Arabic and is transformed into from Sa to Ha and becomes Hindu and Hindustan, and means something like maybe the Indus Valley region, or maybe something like around Gujarat and Malabar. But that's about it. And it has nothing really to do with the subcontinent. It's a outsider's perspective of the the, the place. The other is story, of course, is that this idea of insider outsider, this idea of language being a biology rather than a grammar is something that William Jones is inventing in very real terms, right? So it's a double bind. It's like if I give you the etymology, what I'm telling you is that Hindustan does not belong to subcontinent. But that's not what the much of the written performing record of our subcontinent says. What happens if you look at the sources as I do is that Hindustan is something that all across different types of sources and different types of register is something that is understood to be an idea of almost the entirety of the subcontinent, including Lanka. And this expansive territory, this expansive space, doesn't have a religion attached to it, doesn't have a biology attached to it. It's not like this is a land of Hindus, the religions, but that it's a space that this specific name carries a specific name, and that idea of Hindustan is what is missing or it gets taken away, and that's really basically the crux of the book, right? That the loss of Hindustan and the invention of India is in some ways William Jones's kind of philology putting together.
I would like.
So yeah, I mean, the question was that, I mean, you're talking about William Jones, how he created this distinction. So do you think was that done on purpose, or I mean, essentially he had a very colonial mindset? Does he come from that background, or would you say that it was done simply because as a foreigner it was very difficult for him to grasp the concept of this country, right, this region, and hence he simplified it for his own version, which actually gets distorted after him?
That's a great question. So I think the story that I try to tell in the book, and especially in the last part of the book. So just for your readers, I want to clarify one thing before I go on, which is that the colonial part of the story. So the book has two stories. One is this idea of Hindustan that's before the colonial period, and that period I am talking about there's a historian in the Deccan who's writing in the early part of the 17th century, and he writes basically a Tarikh-i-Hindustan, a history of Hindustan. And it's Firishta, his name is Firishta, and he's writing for one of the courts of Bijapur. And this is, between kind of sort of 1610 and 1620. So it's right as the kind of colonial forces are, gathering steam. And so half of the book is kind of that story, the story of Firishta, and what did Firishta read in order to write about Hindustan, and what did Firishta write about Hindustan. And the other side of the story is this idea of the European arrival. When they come, especially starting with the Portuguese, how do what happens? How do they, are they entering a blank space and they're trying to make sense of it? And they're like, oh, what is a Hindu? What is a Muslim? What's going on? And here, I think something that I would like to say is that obviously Vasco da Gama is there 1498, 1502, 1503, and we imagine that's like a a beginning, like we imagine Christopher Columbus' 1492 is a beginning, right? So these are kind of beginning stories. So Christopher Columbus comes and it's a blank space, and all of the things. But the 1498 is not a blank state, and this is what people don't understand. The Portuguese and the Spanish have spent 400 years in a crusade against Islam, against Muslims, for Jerusalem. They know North Africa well. They know that there are spaces. They know which way India is. They know what's in India, right? And when they say, like, Christopher Columbus was looking for India, I mean, he was looking for India for a reason, right? And so what do they know and what it is? So what happens is, as I mentioned in the book, is that for Vasco da Gama and these people, they are looking for what they call Moors or Muslims everywhere. So they look for Moors in all along the Eastern African coastlines as they move. They pick up what they say are Indian sailors, most likely from Gujarat. They pick them up in current day Ethiopia. And it's with these navigators that they come to Calicut, right? So when they come to Calicut, they already know two things. They know who the Muslims are because they've been engaged in a crusades with the Muslim for so long, and they know they're Christians here. And they know why do they know they're Christians here? Because of this idea of Prester John, this old idea of a Christian king on the other side of the Muslim world. When the Portuguese entered this world, they know that the two religions that they have been engaged in are in conflict with each other, Islam and Christianity. So the first assumption that they have is that Islam is in conflict with whatever it is happening in India, right? Whatever in Hindustan, whatever it is, right? So they have to figure it out. They have to convert and all those things. But their initial idea is that there is religious difference, there is religious conflict. And I detail in the Portuguese earliest accounts, that they are very clear that the two communities could only be having 400 years of conflict, like we are having 400 years of conflict, because that's the way the world is organized. So when you start from that, so this is not a blank state, right? You're actually taking a history from the Iberian and you're importing it to Calicut, and you're importing it to the Mughal court. And so by the time William Jones comes, we are 100 and some plus years, right? 170 years in a sense. And by the time Jones says, oh, here's a history of philology, or here's a history of law that tells you that there are different communities, that tells you that there are different languages, this idea of communities in conflict is incredibly ingrained. And it's without evidence. This is what's tricky about it, right? So when Thomas Rowe comes and he sees the Mughals, he's like, well, this is incredibly tolerant. These people are not killing each other. I got to go tell my king. These people seem to be totally fine. When Thomas Correa came, he writes in his diaries, he's like, this is a incredibly, like, a traveler can walk from, Delhi to Pune and no problem. Nobody's going to say anything to him. I don't understand this. I've never seen anything like this. So William Jones has lots of evidence that disproves his thesis, right? He can read, and he does read all of these things. And he's like, oh yeah, everyone has been saying that there's no conflict. But William Jones has a theory. And that's not just Jones's theory, it's the theory of how to think about the Orient. And that theory is that there's conflict, that there's difference, that there's hatred, that there's oppression, that there's despotism. And so in a way, I want to say, like, in your question, I want to say it's a bit of both. It's both that there is an idea a long-standing idea that has to be implemented, and you're looking for proof of that implementation. You're looking for evidence to make it point.
As you posited in your book, that Loss of Hindustan is a history of Tarikh-i-Firishta and its intellectual world. How the Tarikh-i-Firishta shaped the idea of India, idea of Hindustan?
So Farishta is a very interesting guy, right? He's sometimes he's a diplomat, sometimes he's a physician, sometimes he's basically a escort, a palace guard, a muscle, as you say, but very literate, incredibly kind of steeped in history, poetry, and he comes from a lineage of kind of his father was also in the service of the Deccani sultans, and he has a very clear idea that he wants to write a history of all of Hindustan. And the reason he wants to write a history of all of Hindustan that basically if you're a elite literate guy, I mean he's not elite, he's a service member, right? He's not a prince or anything. He's a salary guy. He gets a salary, right? So, but he's elite in the sense that he's kind of like me. I'm elite in the sense that my job is to think. So I'm a professor, so that's an elite status in that sense. I'm not rich, but that's my that way. So what he's facing is that there are a number of histories that are being written, some in Herat, some in Tehran or Iran, some in Agra, that are universal histories. They're histories of either a dynasty, histories of Akbar, etc., etc. And he's like, I think I have something to say, and I need the right patron. I need someone to kind of sponsor this work. And finally, the Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who's the prince in charge of Bijapur, he's also very learned. He's a musician, incredibly talented musician. He's obviously himself a masterful poet, very involved in the creation of Dakkani, incredibly artistic fellow. So this guy says, "Hey, you know what? You write a history for me. I'm going to commission a work from you, and it's a noras. It has to have a newness to it that has not happened before. It has to have this rasa of wonder and amazement." And Frista says, "Yes, that's what I've been waiting for this commission." So what I was kind of trying to figure out is like you are at the cusp of the beginning of the 17th century. You're living in the Deccan. You're living in a very nice town, Bijapur. But your patron is not Jahangir. Your patron is not the big Mughal king. You're not in the center of the world. You're not in Delhi, Agra, or any Lahore, any of those places. You're like a nice place, but So first of all, you're like, I can write something. So that tells you something about the intellectual world, right? Like there is a right to narrate that the story belongs to me. It doesn't just belong to the largest guy with the largest army. It belongs to me, even if I don't have any army. It doesn't just belong to the person with the most credentials, elite credentials. I can do that. And the second part, that he's sees himself very clearly as part of a long line of histories of Hindustan, historians of Hindustan. So he says, my job is to kind of finish a story that has been happening before me. And what the beginning points of those stories for him are the Mahabharat, because for him, that's where the kind of histories begin of Hindustan. And he's like, I want to tell that story all the way to my present. So for Farishta, to tell the story of Hindustan, it's not a story of simply a political space. It's not a story simply of a linguistic space. It's not a story simply of like what we call communal space, right? but it's a story of a space that has all of these things in it, right? Hindustan has various political entities, has various communities, has various uh, foods and everything else. So that's the story that Firishta wants to tell. And he's very confident that he can tell the story. And he's confident because he says, many people have told parts of this story, and I can read all of them, all of those sources, and I can then write my work. And that's what he does. So he visits all of these libraries, and he, gathers all of these manuscripts in order to write the history of Hindustan. And I think that's, to me, was the kind of a moment that, not that the Portuguese aren't there, they're there, the Germans are there, the French are there, the English are there, and but he's writing a world that is, kind of uh, in danger from the Europeans, from the Ferengis, and he knows about it. He says this. He's like, I think these Ferengis are really, really bad news people. Like why isn't the Mughal court doing more about it? So he has no doubt that the future doesn't look good. And obviously he's proven right, sadly, for all of us.
Would you say that when it comes to the story of Hindustan, there has been a gap? Would you say, because when I read your book and other sources, it seems like the story of Hindustan, it's it's not retold in the history at a regular interval of time. It was as if there was a break, and then this was commissioned. Farista writes it, so there has been a gap, right? So what led to this gap? Was it cultural? Was it because of political environment, which happened before Farista? So where does the origin lie?
So, I think one of the things that it's common sense for us to think about, but we don't imagine it for the world before us, is that, when we do something nowadays, we're very cognizant of kind of the genre in which we do things, right? So, when we pick up a novel, we know what's going to happen in it. When we pick up, like, the nonfiction by William Dalrymple, or a nonfiction by, Yuval Haveli or something, airport like that, and we know what these genres are and what happens. So one of the things that I think was happening with Firishta is that he was saying, look, I know the genres of history writing, and I want to create a new idea in that genre. So what was the genres in which you wrote history? So, there were two basic models. Model one is you look for the political power, right? So the king and the king's father and the king's great grandfather and so on and so forth, all the way back to the gods, right? And you tell that story. So you tell the story of a lineage, a genealogy. So that's one way of telling a history. It's just, you start either with the king that commissioned your work, or you start with the origins of that family, and you go all the way down and you say X is this, and then did this, and then did this, and that's your story. And the second kind of way of doing things was, you defined a region, you defined a place, and you said, you know what, I live in Kashmir, let me tell you the story of Kashmir. I live in, Sindh, let me tell you the story of Sindh. I live in Bengal, let me tell you the story of Bengal. And when you do the space part, you include the people who are the rulers, but you also include other people who may be part of that region, and traders and that kind of stuff. So those are your two models, two genres. Now, what happened is that before Farishta, either if you're looking at the kings may be in one region, or they may be in a different region. So you're really doing small subset of spaces, right? So you're moving place to place. If you're doing a region, you're stuck in that region, and that region has people who go out, but you're just focusing on that, micro history, as they say. So the reason we now see a gap is that Farishta is really the first one to say, I'm going to not do either of those genres. I'm going to take the bigger space, Hindustan, and in that space, I will put the micro spaces and I'll put the various kings. So I think when he begins to compile this vision, what he's starting to do is he goes to the genealogy thing. Then the genealogies are also in Hindustan, but they're focused on the king's name, right? So they're like some of the ones I describe in the book, including Abul Fazl's Akbarnama, for example. Is Akbarnama is a history of Babur and Humayun and Akbar. Um, so I think that's where we see the gaps, right? That Hindustan as a kind of category is not theorized, is not visible for kind of discussion, and this is what Farishta is focusing on as his kind of main kind of topic.
There is a saying in India that most of the Anglo historians who wrote about India never visited India. How this second-hand history writing shaped the idea of India or Hindustan?
So I think history that you and I live with, all of us live with, is a history that is very recent. History writing as a discipline and what we can call a humanistic or a social scientific discipline is very young in that sense. Really, in the Western Academy, people basically can point to the early parts of the 19th century when some of this, Ranke and Hegel and, some of this in the 19th century, this idea of a discipline emerging, and then obviously departments and universities having a major, all these kind of things. It's a new story. There were other genres of writing, like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation is about political economy, right? That's what he's writing. Now, if you read it, there's a lot of history in it as well. Locke's is it's theology, even if it's kind of a theory of government, right? On treatise on government. So one of the things that happens is with people like Edward Gibbon and then James Mill, etc., is that they begin to write, like Farishta, histories of the empire, the British Empire. And when they're writing these world histories, their approach is very different than the travelers who travel to a place or a native who writes their own history. Right now, they also write their own history. There's histories of London. Histories of England that are written, histories of France that are written at the same time that the histories of India are written. But we don't hear that much. We, meaning people of the colonized world, we don't really care about the histories of England or France. We care about what they wrote about us. And so what they do is a process for which Farishta becomes very important. And what they do is that they say, okay, we're going to take 2 or 3 types of information. We're going to take the information of the East India Company, for example. The people who are governing and trading and etc. Whatever they say this is what's happening in India, and it's a report, and we will take that report. Now we will take some of the traveler accounts, some of the people who went to India or Egypt or whatever and wrote something and then they published it and we like them, and we're going to take that stuff. That's the 2 sources. The third we're going to take is grammar. We're going to take language. Now we're not going to learn the language, but we're going to look at the kind of theory of language. Because why? Because theory of language allows us to kind of think about law, religion, all of these other things. And for that, we have philologists who are producing this type of work. So Mill, for example, who spent his whole life working for the East India Company, had no reason to travel to India to write a history of India, write a history of British India in the early part of the 19th century. Because the definition of if it does not require him to learn Persian or Sanskrit or Gujarati or Marathi or anything, just needed access to these resources, which as an East India Company employee he has. And so I think, again, we don't understand this role of power when we think of these things, right? So it's not that they don't, they learn so many languages. right?
Right.
They're learning Latin to write about Rome. So it's not like they don't want to learn Sanskrit. It's that there's no kind of um, methodological reason to do so, because the source material has already been decided, has to come from something. Now, why is Firishta important in this source? The reason Firishta becomes so important is that in the around the 1760s, Alexander Dow, who's again an infantry major in the infantry, Bengal infantry, with Hastings, is someone who decides to learn Persian after having learned Sanskrit, some Sanskrit. He starts to learn Persian, and his reason for learning Persian is that he wants to write a history of the empire. And in order to do so, he said that he asked people, and the people gave him Firishta's history and said, "This is our best history." And so he takes this back to London and he publishes it in 1768, a rendition of it, and then another volumes in 1772. And those renditions by Dow become the source material for Edward Gibbon, whose Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire has a whole history of Islam and a whole history of India. It becomes important for Kant. It becomes important for Herder. It becomes important for many of these figures. James Mill, father of J.S. Mill. So all of this, Firishta is a source material. He's very rarely named. Sometimes he's named, sometimes he's not named. Sometimes it's Tao is named instead of Firishta. But all of them are using these translations, these renditions, to write their histories. And they're like, yeah, this is, we need one kind of volume, and this is the volume that we're going to use for that purpose.
Okay. We have been taught that India is called Bharat in Hindi, Hindustan in Urdu, and India in English. If that is true, then why do we need a different translation for one country name?
So I think it's always think about, let's say, the word translation. The word Bharat or Hindustan or India are all talking about the same thing. They're not talking about the same things. They're not talking about the same kind of political spaces. They're not talking about the same territorial spaces. And they're not thinking about the same histories when they're being used in these registers. So they're not equivalences. Now that obviously is the first line of the Constitution. So I'm not saying it's not correct. I'm just saying it's not the same, right? And I think in that sense, Hindustan, the way in which Hindustan was used for a very long time, carried with it a type of idea of the political space, of a social space, that Bharat and India do not. They don't carry that same notions. India, for example, even though it's a very, very old, old word, as in we find it in Greek sources, it's when it could very well mean East Africa, and it could very well mean Oman and Yemen, and it could very well mean the Coromandel Coast. It just depends on the source you're looking for. And so you can't say that the word India means the same thing, for the entirety of human history. And similarly for Bharat, and then similarly for Hindustan. But Hindustan at least has an incredibly long documented career that I try to trace of almost 800, 900 years. And Hindustan is the one that gets erased. So it's not that we need to replace one with the other. It's that we kind of vacate Hindustan, say, oh, Hindustan is just India and Hindi. Well, it's not, because India came into being in 1947. India is not something that exists outside of that framework, like Pakistan came into being in 1947. That's what I would say.
So how does Hindustan differ from Hindustan?
So this is an argument that Savarkar makes. Savarkar, in his kind of in his formulation, in my introduction, I contrast Iqbal's Tarana, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, with Savarkar's Tarana on Hindustan. And what Savarkar is doing is that he makes two claims. He rejects Jones's claim. He says, this idea that Hindu is a word that Arabs gave to the subcontinent is wrong. Hindu is our word. This is our word. This is our language. This is not an invention of the Arabs. But he says the Stan of Persian, right, which is like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, the Stan. He said that's not correct. It's actually Stan of Sanskrit. So for him, Hindustan was a space, not Hindustan, which was a space that had Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and everyone else and all kinds of politics. For him, Hindustan was a place that belonged only to Hindus because only the Hindus belonged to it, as in their gods, their languages, their people. And the real kind of critical difference here is that for him, you could be a Muslim and be born in Hindustan, but because you prayed to a god that was you prayed towards facing Mecca. Mecca was in Arabia. Your gods were not inside Hindustan, and hence you were a foreigner. You were also an invader, and you were also a despot that he had all of this violence against Muslims. But the fundamental kind of difference was that the gods are outside, and so a Christian can convert and become part of Hindustan, but a Muslim had a problem because their gods are always outside. They're always facing east, and the east is Kaaba, Mecca. So Hindustan then becomes a place where only the gods of the Vedas, the only believers of those gods can stay. So that's his distinction between Hindustan and Hindustan.
Yeah. So, how did Abul Fazl introduce the conceptual Hindustan?
So, I think Abul Fazl, who wrote this history of can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me or not? Okay.
Yes, yes.
So Abul Fazl wrote this history of Jalaluddin Akbar, and for Abul Fazl, Hindustan was basically part of what the Mughals wanted to control. They didn't control all of it, but they were a major ruling body inside Hindustan. For Firishta, Hindustan was a very kind of full space. So it goes from Kabul all the way to Bengal, it goes from the Himalayas all the way to Lanka. And this kind of triangle is actually very old. I mean, we see this in the Ashokan edicts. If we look at the where Ashokan edicts are placed, this is very much a part of Hindustan in that sense. We see this in the various Jain pilgrimage maps. We see this in obviously Buddhist sites. And then our earliest geographies from the 8th and 9th century, like Masudi's Muruj al-Dahab, they also have that same idea of basically Himalayas at the top, Lanka at the bottom, Bengal and Kabul or Lahore on this end. And so this is a very consistent kind of subcontinental idea that we see for a very long time. And so I think Firishta's innovation is that he's willing to write a history of it, Now, this again, I think it's very, it's very difficult to think. How do you write a history if it's not about a person, or how do you write a history if it's about so many different places? Like that wasn't done as a genre. So I think that's his innovation. He's like, oh yeah, I can tell the story of this whole place without it being a story of one family.
Yeah, so as per your book, idea of Hindustan incepted around 1000 CE. So what about before 1000 CE? Was India not a union of kingdoms? We have references of Chakravarti Samraj.
Yeah, I think I'm focusing on is from 1000 CE because that's my focus. But it's not an invention in the 1000 CE, right? It's a continuation, like I said, of the idea of the Chakravartin, idea of the Ashokan edicts. So these are ideas that are there, and then I am starting to trace them from more or less ninth and 10th century forward. Why? Because what Firishta does. So, right, I'm saying, okay, what did Firishta read? I'll read the same thing. How did he think of his archive? I will think through the same archive. And for Firishta, he goes from the Mahabharat to the kind of early 8th, 9th century sources, and then from there forward. But this is not something that is invented by any means in the 9th or 10th century.
So, we had a discussion about William Jones, right? So there are three historians which you, or rather military officers, which you talk about in your book: Jonathan Scott, Alexander Dow, and John Briggs. So, I mean, how much did they actually borrow it from William Jones, and what was their motivation behind writing a history of India? I mean, were they doing it solely for to advancing their career? They were at the end of the day salaried employees, and so and their books eventually, as you mentioned in the book, became very famous in right, I mean, in Britain. So, was that the motivation, or was it also that, hey, let's divide and rule?
I think their primary motivation is rule, right? And that's their actual job. They're military officers. They're actual military officers. They're engaged in warfare and in killings. And then after, in the evening, they can kind of have their munshis help them decipher something and write these books. Or when they retire, most cases, they retire at the age of 32, so it's not like old, but when they leave India after making money. But their first purpose of writing is rule. Now, why would translating a Firishta or writing a history of India be useful for ruling purpose? I think that's the question, right? Why you're a military officer, you're already fighting the Marathas, you're fighting the Sikhs, you're fighting Sindhis, you're fighting the Mughal Empire, you're fighting the Bengal Nawabs. What do you need a history book for? When the U.S. Went to Philippines or went to Puerto Rico or went to Iraq or went to Afghanistan, no general or colonel in the U.S. Army wrote a history of any of these places. The U.S. Empire doesn't care about any of these things. As in, they're like, whatever. We don't need to write a history of Afghanistan. We don't need to write a history of Iraq. So why is the history part important? I think the fundamental part is that for the British, the conquest of the past was just as important as the conquest of the space. It was just as important to write the history according to their understanding as it was to govern a place that they had conquered. And the reason that I could surmise, and there are other scholars who have written on this much more brilliant minds than mine, I must say. But the reason that I think that their conquest of the past was so important for the conquest of the space was that the British conquest isn't really tied to an idea of kind of religious supremacy, like the Portuguese, we're here to convert, etc. It's not civilizational, colonial settler idea. We're not here to vacate everyone and then, bring our people and create a new colony. Not in India. I mean, obviously they're doing this in America at the same time. And I think for them, the impulse to conquer and extract resources and all of those things needed also a kind of intellectual component, a kind of rationale for it, and the knowledge part of it, the creation of knowledge, the creation of grammars, histories, dictionaries, folktale compendiums, all of this production that they do, and they consistently do it, has to be because it what justified, in a sense, the plunder and the devastation and the violence and the barbarity. It was the kind of the positive side of it, as it were, for them, not for us. And so what you see is that you see these figures like Jonathan Scott, who's a secretary of Warren Hastings, who is also translating or rendering Firishta. These are men who are in active warfare, right? And for Scott, it's like, you know what? I really want to render Firishta's fifth and sixth book on the Deccan because the Maratha wars are happening. Now, the Maratha wars are happening against the Marathas, and they're happening right now. What the heck is Firishta going to do to you? Like, Firishta has been dead for 150 years. Nobody, like Firishta doesn't have like anything that's going to help you defeat the Marathas in 1770s, 1780s. But that's not how Jonathan Scott is thinking. He's thinking, yes, while we have this active military front, same thing with Briggs, who also does a rendition of Firishta. I want to provide this history, this idea of the past, the space, in my words, in my language, under my name, dedicated to the East India Company, published at the same time. And I think that's an incredibly important kind of connection to the violence of colonialism and the conquest of the past. That is very important for these soldiers.
So, if this was writing the books or creating a new narrative was part of the political strategy to how to control this land, were these writings were translated in other Indian languages and pushed to the masses, or
Yeah.
are there? Was it done? Or, for instance, are there other examples of it being done in other parts of the world? For instance, maybe in Ottomans or maybe in Middle East or somewhere else where Britain actually ruled.
Yeah. So thank you. That's a great question. So one thing is that these histories are immediately translated into French and German, right? So that tells you there's a market, but it's in Europe. Right, so it's not a market. They're not translated into Bangla or Tamil or anything. Second, they are produced almost everywhere, right? So the famous example that Edward Said used is the Napoleon's conquest of Egypt, where he took an entire army, basically a battalion of historians and draftsmen and scientists to create, our narrative about Egypt. Ancient Egypt. So they're certainly being done in Africa, but the conquest of Africa is happening after they've already been in the subcontinent. So the model for kind of how to link past history with the future is certainly invented here, I think, for us, for India. And then transported or applied to different other colonial settings. Some places they have a theories, right? So there's also racial hierarchies. Africa, for example, under this system has no history possible because they don't have thought possible. So according to Hegel and others, Africa can't have a history. So you don't want, you're not going to write a history of Africa. And the Indians are frozen in time. They don't move. The history doesn't move there. So that's what Marx was saying, right? Marx was saying you need colonialism in order to get these people out of their frozen status in the feudalism. So you could still write a history of India, but the purpose of that history is to kind of bring the future, bring the liberal future, liberalism, right? So you have to kind of think about the hierarchies that colonial mind has for the various colonized people of the world, and see whether this type of, so for example, for the natives in America, you don't write their histories. You only capture their grammars because you're eliminating them, you're wiping them out, you're killing them, you're destroying them. So you're trying to preserve a bit of their language. Why? For your maps. You want their place names, really. You don't even want their language more than that. You want what they call things. So these are different strategies based on the kind of racial hierarchy that the colonized world is put in by the colonial mind.
How colonial idea of India is not good for India and Pakistan, and how it led to its partition.
So, I think causes are very difficult to ascertain, right? If something happened in 1947, did it happen because something happened in 1940, or did it happen because something happened in 1770? You see what I mean? Like, where do you kind of go for cause and effect? What is a cause and what is an effect, right? Is 47 because of 40 or 30 or 20? Isn't that like 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? Isn't that where cause and effect is more clear? I mean, if I tell you, like, yeah, William Jones thought Hindus and Muslims were separate, and then Jinnah says in 1940 Hindus and Muslims are separate, am I saying that 1770 and to 1940 is the same thing? I mean, that's, I think there's an ideas, and their ideas have power, and they frame things. But there are many different causes that can happen, right? So partition happened for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is that there's a 200 some plus year project of colonial difference making, right? That we can't discount that part. We can't discount that for 200 years, there's an entire production of knowledge, whether in linguistics, in history, in political theory, in literature, in law, that says that these two communities cannot coexist, and that one community has a despotic rule over the other community. So you can't say that that does not have an effect. Now, is it the cause in the immediate sense of 47? I mean, obviously, no. There's a lot more going on in the 40s, including the US empire, which has a lot to say about what happens in the subcontinent. And so, Lord Mountbatten's papers are just being released. So we will learn more about actually what happened in 47, hopefully.
Talk about, right, I mean, the book by Jonathan Sport getting translated into French and German languages. I think you discuss in your book, right, how post-independence, the Hindustani historians continued the same narrative, which was pushed by the colonial historians or military officers. So why is it so?
I think that's the main challenge of my work. I think, which I mentioned in the beginning, right? What does it mean to write a decolonial history? So even if we gained independence in 47, to this day, many of the laws in India, many of the laws in Pakistan are just colonial laws. They're just literally colonial laws. I mean, we've added some new, features to it, but it's literally just colonial law. And many of our kind of structures of governance, many of the ways in which we organize ourselves politically, are just colonial. Obviously, the idea of independence and the idea of democracy, especially independent democracy, is something that um, has flourished in some senses, has setbacks in some senses, but the infrastructure is a colonial infrastructure. And what continues into the into post-partition period are some of these basic understandings that the colonial state puts in, including the difference between Hindus and Muslims, including the idea that there's an ancient golden period and a dark medieval period, and including the idea of who belongs. How many generations do I have to be born in Lahore to be a Hindustani? Is it 2? Is it 20? How I mean, there's this silly. I mean, these sound silly things, but they're basmati is a the word basmati for rice is Indian and not Pakistani. In the Pakistani states, but it is in Harappan, Mohenjo-daro, bowls we see rice and it's basmati there, and the Indian foreign minister is saying no, it's a Sanskrit word. Well, I have news for the Indian foreign minister, because Sanskrit's main space was Peshawar and Taxila. So I don't know what to tell you, man. So these types of contestations, these types of ideas that are colonial, continue. So how do we kind of think of decoloniality here? How do we tell stories of our past that can still be nationalism? Because obviously nationalism isn't going anywhere, right? It's not that, but it's France and England can fight for hundreds of years, including two major world wars in the 20th century, and be nationalistic, but still be able to kind of understand some sense of the past. Germany kills 6+ million human beings and is more or less forgiven and welcomed back, becomes part of, now is the most important member of the EU. So so you think about these things, and when you think about the subcontinent, suddenly it's like, oh, 5,000 years of difference. Suddenly it's like we can never talk to each other, because this just can't be possible. We can't just have I mean, the Catholics and the Protestants can go for wars, and then they can have a conversation. The Anglicans can do that. The Lutherans can do that. But suddenly the Shias and Sunnis can't do that. Suddenly, the Hindus and the Muslims can't do that. So all of these are colonial constructions. Our laws, our ways of thinking, our ways of who do we have a conversation with, who do we enter into relationships with. And I think we need, and I don't say this because I am, this is not simply about kind of peace in that sense. We are all boiling. We're going to die. Our water is evaporating. Our air is boiling. We don't have a future on this planet if we don't stop the climate crisis. We don't have a future if all of our rivers dry up. And we can't solve this, right? We can't. India can't solve the water table issue alone. Besides Pakistan, Pakistan can't solve it without India, right? So it's like all of us will cease to exist. The projection is that by 2050, 300 million plus people would have to move away from places that they currently inhabit, because the places they currently inhabit will either be underwater or will be a desert. 300 million people are not going to go anywhere except over to the other side, whatever other side is. By 2030, that estimate is 100 million. 2030 is not far away. So I think if you say, oh, India and Pakistan can never work together, okay, well then we just have water wars, we just fight, we just detonate nukes on each other, and that's the end of things. But what I'm trying to say is that we actually, and this is what the historians of Hindustan were saying during the colonial period, is that we are all part of a shared space, shared political, shared physical space. And that this shared space gives us all a responsibility to work towards a better future, a more equitable future. And I think for us, the idea of Hindustan can at least hint towards a way of thinking together such that we can face the climate issue, such that we can face the question of resources and dwindling supplies of oxygen, as has happened during COVID and during this global pandemic, where, again, the question of who can give aid to who can fly over whose airspace. I mean, you think about it, right? You think about, like, if your neighbor is ill, if your physical neighbor, the person who lives next to your house, is ill, and you're like, I won't let aid go to you, and I won't let you go outside into the lane. And you'll be like, what are you talking about? Like, you're all next door to each other. So, I mean, I'm a historian of a long time ago, but I think what I want to say is that we face extinction if we don't come together and think of our shared past. And we have a shared past, no matter what.
Yeah, thanks for I mean, essentially we will take one more. Can we ask one last question? And then,
Sure.
yeah. So sorry, we are over time. It's like already 10 minutes. But yeah, I just wanted to understand what are the other works other things you are working on. I mean, any other books in pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on a book on Lahore for a long time, so that's the book that I'm hoping to finish next. It's sort of thinking about Lahore across 1,000+ years, just to think about, one of the cities that has a Puranic past, and it has a medieval past, and has a post-colonial past. That I'm really interested in kind of thinking about Lahore as a place from which to think about the future. Actually, I mean, again, right now we're in the 40s. In 5 years, this space is supposed to be in the 50s, 50 degrees centigrade. The water table, when Babur came through Lahore, one of the things he said was that the reason there are no canals here, no irrigation system, was that any person in any point in Lahore can start digging wherever they're standing, and within 3 feet would hit water. So Punjab, the Punjab was that the water table was so high that you could grow anything you want. The water table now is somewhere in 30 feet and sinking. So can there be a Lahore in 2050? No, actually, no. There can't be a Lahore, because there won't be any water here, and it will be too hot to live here. So what does it mean? What does it mean for a city to disappear that has been here for so long? And what do we do? What do we do about its history? There are Mughal forts here. There's Sikh buildings here. There are temples that are much older. A lot of history in this place, but we're also don't have a future in that sense. In the sense of just climate and devastation. So that's something that I'm working on.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Manan, for joining us and talking about your work and your future goals. Appreciate you joining us, and we wish you best for your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Really a pleasure talking to you, and I thank you both for doing the work that you do and telling the people about historians, boring historians like myself. So appreciate that.
Yeah, not for us. No boring, not for us. I'm sure also not for our viewers.
All right.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.